Hobart nestles on the world's fringe, wedged between Mount Wellington and the Derwent River. Established as a penal outpost in 1804, it evolves into Australia's second oldest urban centre, shifting from a jailhouse domain to a bustling contemporary hub. Here's the tale of how a small band of prisoners and troops erected a metropolis in one of Earth's remotest corners. Two British vessels, Resolution and Adventure, make a stop in Tahiti back in the 1770s. Captain James Cook leads the voyage with young William Bligh on board. Their mission involves mapping the Pacific. Before long, members of this crew arrive at Van Diemen's Land. Bligh renders drawings of the southeast shoreline, highlighting a broad river inlet. An ideal anchorage, he observes. Though unnamed at the time, the site has now drawn the gaze of Europeans. This marks the onset of upheaval for 40,000 years of Aboriginal heritage. In 1803, Lieutenant John Bowen lands with 49 individuals, about half of them convicts. They initially attempt Risdon Cove, but relocate to Sullivan's Cove the next year for superior freshwater access. David Collins assumes leadership and dubs it Hobart Town. Come the 1820s, as convict illustrator John Glover depicts the scene, the outpost is gaining form. Modest homes dot the shoreline. Vessels moor in the inlet. The community hugs the water's edge beneath Mount Wellington's looming presence. Just under 3 decades post-founding, Hobart Town boasts substantial structures. Its residents number 10,000. More convicts keep coming, yet free immigrants arrive as well, seeking territory and prospects. Revenue from whale oil surges via the harbor. Yankee whaling craft pause there, en route from Antarctic pursuits. The settlement extends along the Derwent, fanning out from Sullivan's Cove. Mount Wellington remains the skyline's focal point, but streets, parks, and an expanding colonial hub now take root. John Glover illustrates Tasmanian Aboriginal communities performing dances along the Derwent's eastern bank in 1834. Hobart Town looms across the estuary in the distance. The artwork preserves a vanishing essence. The Black War has intensified over recent years. George Augustus Robinson continues gathering surviving Aboriginal Tasmanians, relocating them to Flinders Island. In the following 10 years, disease and desolation claim most lives. Glover's canvas serves as a testament to the losses inflicted by European arrival. By 1858, Hobart Town spans a complete square mile. Local etcher Richard Jarman produces a chart revealing the outpost's advance from Sullivan's Cove into the interior. A network of roads aligns with the harbor front. Places of worship, official structures, and storage facilities emerge. Parliament House rises in 1869. Tasmania secures self-rule in 1856. Granting this edifice genuine authority. With its classic pillars and sandstone exteriors, it signals the end of mere frontier status. Lawmakers convene within as the urban area expands further. Hobart's inhabitants surpass 20,000. The structure endures in that location even now, among Australia's longest-running active legislatures. The Cascades Female Factory launches in 1828 as the sole detention site for women in the colony. Female prisoners reside, toil, and deliver babies within its confines. Among them are pilferers, sex workers, and those who merely took loaves of bread. The environment proves harsh. Isolation cells, grueling tasks, and child separations define daily life. By its closure, in 1877, countless women have endured its gates. Numerous descendants reside in Tasmania presently, inheriting narratives their forebears wished to bury. This aerial perspective from 1879 reveals Hobart's remarkable progress. The orderly layout radiates from the port, Mount Wellington rising imposingly in the rear. Craft throng the docks. Residents reach 25,000. Breweries, preserves plants, and lumber operations fuel commerce. The locale now features playhouses, publications, and financial institutions. Its origins in penal servitude fade from prominence. Non-convict arrivals eclipse former inmates. Hobart emerges as a refined Victorian settlement at the globe's southern tip. Photographer Bay records Hobart from a vessel in Sullivan's Cove in 1900. Tall ships still pepper the bay, even as steam power gains ground. Mount Wellington commands the vista. Snow dusts its summit. The shore teems with depots and wool depots. Hobart ships out apples, wood, and zinc. Federation looms the following year, elevating Tasmania to statehood from colonial rule. The populace totals 35,000, all confined amid peak and ocean. Electric streetcars traverse Elizabeth Street during the 1910s. Hobart's primary retail avenue hums with energy. Folks in Edwardian attire stroll the pathways. Automobiles begin mingling with horse-pulled wagons. Structures reflect Victorian design with elaborate fronts and bell spires. Outlets offer goods ranging from provisions to home goods. The trolley lines link the core to outlying areas, extending from the wharves into neighborhoods. Hobart now conveys a sense of modernity, tied to the wider realm through wires and ocean liners. This gritty district carries a tough image, nestled along the harbor's edge and bustling with seamen, laborers, and their households. Folks label it a makeshift settlement. Yet take a second glance. These sturdy homes of stone and brick stand firm, far from flimsy huts. Ordinary workers dwell here, right by the docks, supporting themselves through daily toil. The community bonds closely, neighbors all familiar with one another. It's bustling with activity. Noisy, yes, but for countless Hobart households, it remains their cherished base. Elizabeth Street slices straight through Hobart's core. On one flank, the imposing General Post Office towers with its clock overseeing the scene. Elegant business structures flank either side. Streetcars glide along the center. Here pulses the commerce, the daily shopping, the chance for the town to flaunt its vibrancy. The thoroughfare rises steadily from the port, linking the docks to living quarters that fan out across the hillsides. It serves as Hobart's vital vein, channeling trade and foot traffic right into the urban heart. What endures through the mid-20th century? Children dash about in these lanes. Households continue occupying the vintage laborers' dwellings, though the area's future hangs in the balance. City officials spot decay amid what locals view as heritage. The structures age, with some falling into disrepair. Post-war Australia craves sleek, orderly progress. Come the 1960s, heavy machinery will raise the lot. Those youngsters, captured in images, will mature to find their old haunts unrecognizable. Gazing northward from the Customs House in the 1910s, Hobart's public hub unfolds. City Hall commands attention amid the era's ornate Victorian edifices. Streetcars weave through the avenues. The place buzzes with energy. Residents number nearly 40,000. World War I looms poised to upend it all. Before long, these paths will host enlistment rallies and send-off marches. Countless Tasmanian lads will sign up, and plenty will never return. Yet presently, Hobart chugs steadily onward, a thriving harbor outpost on the Empire's fringe. Beyond the Derwent River lies Bellarive Beach, a retreat from urban hustle. On days off, groups hop the ferry across. Youngsters splash in the waves. Pairs wander the shoreline. This serene coastal enclave feels distant from the frantic docks. Even summertime chills the sea. Still, it draws crowds unabated. Australia's love for the shore gains momentum. Locals master swimming and savor downtime. Bellarive turns into Hobart's favored leisure spot, just a quick 20-minute crossing by boat. In 1920, the Palace Theatre presides over Elizabeth Street. Mute movies screen inside, Charlie Chaplin's humorous reels, tear-jerking tales. Nearby, builders erect a new structure where the former Bank of Van Diemen's Land once stood. The town rebuilds and updates itself. The Great War has ended. Returning troops face a transformed landscape. Glowing bulbs light the cinema's sign after dark. Hobart dips into the jazz age, albeit a subdued local take compared to the flair in Melbourne or Sydney. A two-level streetcar navigates the Lenna Valley route circa 1920. These vehicles form Hobart's essential network, tying outlying areas to downtown. Employees commute via them to the wharves. Patrons board for errands on Elizabeth Street. The top level leaves passengers open to the elements, but the scenery compensates. Mount Wellington rises dramatically in the distance. The lines persist until 1960, supplanted then by motor buses. Veterans of the system lament the decision to dismantle the rails. On October 20th, 1914, Tasmanian troops embark from Hobart's wharf, bound for conflict many expect to wrap by Christmas. Multitudes throng the piers for goodbyes. Brass bands blare, ladies flutter scarves, parents fight back tears. These young men join the Australian Imperial Force, voyaging initially to Egypt for drills, then to Gallipoli. For numerous among them, this marks their final step on native soil. The island state sacrifices 13,000 lives by war's close. A viewpoint atop Mount Wellington reveals Hobart in the 1930s. The Great Depression strikes fiercely. Joblessness soars. Fruit growers suffer plummeting apple values. Still the settlement expands, encircling the bay. That twisting path to the peak draws sightseers. Folks motor up for leisure drives, halt their autos, and survey the panorama unfurling beneath. The peak endures as Hobart's signature landmark, ever present on horizons, guarding against gales from the south. From overhead, Hobart's layout clicks into place. The urban sprawl hugs Sullivan's Cove, hemmed by Mount Wellington. Neighborhoods extend northward and southward beside the Derwent. Vessels anchor in the port. Inhabitants approach 60,000. Flight reshapes access to Tasmania. Aircraft bridge to Melbourne in mere hours versus the all-night boat ride. Yet Hobart stays remote, modest, traditional, a backwater hub where acquaintances abound. A handful of clans hold sway over commerce. In 1940, stevedores pack apples at King's Pier. The region's fruit trade booms. These cargoes will ship to Britain, sustaining a wartime populace. World War II erupts once more, prompting Tasmanian men to sign up for service, though now the threat seems much nearer. Japan poses a growing menace. The docks hum with the frenzy of war efforts. Vessels must be packed quickly and dispatched before U-boats from Germany can stalk them. During the conflict, shipments of apples sustained Tasmania's economy. In about 1950, the rail station in Hobart stands near Senator. After the war, Australia experiences a surge in prosperity. Veterans return to civilian life. Business expands rapidly. Notice the archway on the street topped with a crown. It honors the 1954 royal tour. Queen Elizabeth II is set to arrive in Hobart, prompting the town to polish its image. In time, this spot transforms into Franklin Square, featuring its fountain and traffic circle. For the moment, however, locomotives continue to chug along, linking the urban center to northern regions. Come the 1970s, the old wharves have vanished. Factories, fuel depots, and port operations now occupy the sites of former modest homes for laborers. The close community of sturdy stone dwellings and bonded households lies in ruins. Torn down for development. They dubbed it advancement, city redevelopment. The harbors demand up-to-date setups, not outdated lodging from the 1800s. Some longtime residents recall their childhood games in those lanes. Today, everything's reduced to slabs of concrete and sheet metal. The former inhabitants dispersed to distant neighborhoods, surviving solely in recollections.